We've seen the blood. We've seen the fights. Now, am I saying, and have I ever said that all these campus protests are violent and all the protesters are violent? No, because nuance is our friend. And I tend to think that we're pretty good at nuance here on the Undivided podcast. But to cover, as a journalist, as a commentator, whatever it is, to cover what's happening at UW and completely ignore violence, that's a choice. That's a choice to ignore it and to hide it from your viewers or your readers. And that's exactly what King 5 News did. This segment is brought to you by Eastside Weight Loss Clinic. I'm down 37 pounds on the program, and I lost most of that in just 2 months. Do what I did and what so many other Undivided viewers have done. Schedule your free 15-minute consultation today at eastsideweightlossclinic.com. Just as a reminder, the pro-Palestine demonstration at UW, and it had been, some scuffles here and there. And then when Charlie Kirk came to town on Tuesday night, there were full-blown fights. Jonathan Cho's security guard ended up getting jumped by a handful of Antifa rioters.
You okay? We should call the cops.
Yeah. And so there was no question. That wasn't the only time. Jonathan Cho had been there over the weekend. He got attacked. He had a big gash on his hand. And there had been other melees and other fights between the two sides. And it was clear. It was all over social media. Undeniable. Can't avoid it. Again, you don't have to paint the whole thing as violent. Charlie Kirk was able to come. He had his event. It was a huge showing and all of that. And then you had people who just remained in their camp at UW. And they didn't participate in the, blocking things and blocking paths and all of that. But violence happened. And as the media, if you want to paint a full and accurate picture, you can't leave that out, right? Well, apparently at King 5 News, you can. So there was a report that night from Cornelius Hocker with King 5 News. And the entire report, if you only watched King 5 News, you would believe that this was just a peaceful, righteous, love fest, pro-peace gathering for Gaza.
From the UW light rail station to the quad on campus, demonstrators led by the grassroots group Palestinian Youth Movement marched to the University of Washington to support the students in this encampment.
We've seen time and time again how the students have led the fight for justice, for freedom.
Hossam says the people in Gaza see what's happening on college campuses.
Said that the student movement, what they call the student intifada, is what has been giving them hope.
So, okay. The whole thing was like that. Oh, love for Palestine, grassroots. Okay, listen, the grassroots. Let's not pretend that there aren't outside forces that are organizing all of this. Oh, and then there's this part of the story where it talks about, and it shows, people in hospitals in Gaza, and the whole thing is just entirely from the perspective of these protesters. What they're doing is wonderful. What these kids are doing is going to save the world, right? And so you watch the whole story, nothing about Charlie Kirk's appearance, nothing about the violence until the news anchor at King 5 asks Cornelius Hocker this follow-up question at the end of the report.
Obviously, it looks very quiet out there right now. I know the university had told us earlier that it had put extra security out there, at least earlier. Do we know why that was?
Yeah, so tonight there was I guess you could call it a conservative provocateur on campus holding an event, and the university did not want those two groups to interact. However, there were some interactions, some yelling back and forth, but it didn't get that serious. Greg?
Can you play that again, Nicole? It's utterly insane to me.
Obviously, it looks very quiet out there right now. I know the university had told us earlier that it had put extra security out there, at least earlier. Do we know why that was?
Yeah, so tonight there was I guess you could call it a conservative provocateur on campus holding an event, and the university did not want those two groups to interact. However, there were some interactions, some yelling back and forth, but it didn't get that serious. Greg?
It didn't get that serious. Tell that to Jonathan Cho's security guard.
You okay? We should call the cops.
Yeah, bleeding from his neck, bleeding from his face. Cops had to be called. but it didn't get that serious. The other thing is the choice here. And I want to set this up just again. I'm not a journalist anymore, and I never pretend to be. I'm a political commentator. I'm here to give my opinion. I don't want King 5 News to do what I do. I don't want King 5 News to take positions, to show their bias and all of that. So there's a different standard here. But I'm going to put my journalist cap back on. You know, I was a journalist for a long time. I think I was an okay one. And if you're approaching this story, the only mention of Charlie Kirk, there were lines around the quad of people who showed up to hear a national political figure talk and welcome debate on what was happening on college campuses. And then, yes, you had protesters in the quad, and then in the middle you had some scuffling, right? And some fighting and some downright beatings. So if I'm a journalist approaching that, I'm thinking, how can I tell the totality of this situation while not giving any one group any favor of the, you know, because if it's just like 3 people in the quad and then 1,000 people for Charlie Kirk and you focus on what's happening in the quad, that just shows an inherent bias. And that's what this reporter does. The entire story, because if you take the bias this reporter had, a clear left bias, which we'll get to more in a second, and then you have a reporter that has a right bias, how would they cover the story? Well, they would cover Charlie Kirk's appearance and only Charlie Kirk's appearance. And they would talk about how great and wonderful it was and how Charlie Kirk is saving the country and all of this. And they would ignore what's happening on the quad. So that would be equally bad. It would just be a different kind of bias. But a good journalist would look at this situation and would tell the story of what's happening on campus. And it's interesting. You know, a conservative provocateur, as he says, doesn't even name him. Charlie Kirk comes to campus, thousands of people, 1,000 people, whatever it was, lined up to see him. Meantime, just 50 yards away, you've got this protest in support of Palestine. The two sides clashed at points. Here's some video of an assault on a security guard. And then you can tell their stories and you can talk to them. But that's not what this was. This was just a pro-Palestine commercial. And without, this looks like maybe a young journalist or something, and I'm not trying to, well, yeah, I am. You know what? Yeah, I am. You're a journalist in Seattle. You're on a news station in Seattle. This was a horrible story. Horrible, horrible, horrible. And I had to look at this reporter's X account. And then I was like, well, now it makes sense. So again, Cornelius Hawker, if we look at his X account, he's got a big trans rights banner. Trans rights are human rights in the banner, like the cover photo on his X account. It says, journalist, just a guy from Kentucky, living the dream, clarinetist as well, hashtag Black Lives Matter, hashtag Black Trans Lives Matter. Okay. Now, I believe Black people's lives matter. I believe that trans people are human beings that are deserving of human rights. I believe all those things. But if you're a journalist at a major television station, and that is the forward-facing look of your social media, that tells me you're driven by ideology. You're driven by your position and your opinion on political and social issues. Because most of us, I hope, 99% of journalists, certainly in Seattle, they think Black Lives Matter. They might not support the group Black Lives Matter because it was just a fraud, of course, money laundering scheme. But do I have to say it was like a money laundering scheme so I don't get sued? I mean, they just spent people's money on mansions and stuff. So a lot of people believe that, but that's not going to be their trans lives matter. It tells people you're ideologically driven. So when I watch a story like the one you did that went out to tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of households to influence their minds on what happened, and then I look at your social media, I'm like, that sounds about right. And I can't imagine if this was a reporter that had some sort of like a Blue Lives Matter flag. You think King 5 would allow one of their news reporters to have their main picture on their page be a Blue Lives Matter flag? Not a chance in hell. Absolutely not a chance in hell. But this is trans rights flag and it's Black Lives Matter. So you can't say anything about that. You can't say anything about that dripping with ideology. But if it were an ideology on the right, which I don't think Blue Lives Matter is, but then not okay. And I know that's hypothetical, but I'm 100% confident that King 5 News would never allow a reporter to fly a Blue Lives flag in the profile of their official Twitter account. It's really insane stuff. And again, it just angers me because this is what people are getting. The vast majority of people, they're not doing what you're doing. You're not watching this show at noon on a weekday unless you are really, really into politics and social issues and what's happening in our state and in our country. But a lot of Americans, we have to remember, they're just passive news consumers. They turn on the news in the morning or at night to catch the weather and traffic, and then they might see a report like this, and they might be like, wow, look at these kids on campus, like fighting for Gaza, and nothing serious happened, and oh, some conservative provocateur was there. Shame on him, provoking people on campus and all these innocent kids. That's what happens. And then that's how we end up with the Governor Jay Inslee for three terms. I mean, it's all tied together, right? Really unbelievable.